And it gives me great pleasure to introduce briefly Robert Lieberman. Rob, Bethon member who you know and love, and also the professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University, and is the author of 4 books and the editor of a number of other books. These are highly awarded and renowned books in the field of comparative politics, democratic vulnerability, which is a field he's expert in and written more and more about in recent years, and the relationship between race and American political institutions, including the topic of his first book, how race is really inscribed into the deep structure of the welfare of the American liberal welfare state. His last book in 2020 was about recurring threats to American democracy, and I believe he has another one, a co-written book coming out called Democratic Resilience, if I'm not mistaken. And he was able to bench Gomel after being provost of Johns Hopkins from 2013 to 2016. But not only was he able to bench Gomel, he really introduced good things to the institution. So not only did he contribute, but he got out alive. So it's a wonderful combination. So very much looking forward to hearing your talk about threats to democracy in this political age. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. So as I told Zach, it wouldn't be a shul talk without source sheets. So I handouts. Not quite the same as what you're used to, but all right, so thanks very much. I'm going to talk a little bit, but you should feel free to interrupt with questions or puzzlements or comments or throw rotten fruit or whatever. What I want to do is talk a little bit about what I think we can agree is a crisis of American democracy. But I want to talk about it not so much in terms of the present. I want to talk about it in more in historical context. This is not the first time that this has happened, that this kind of thing has happened in the United States, and that's the backdrop for what I want to talk about. And this is what the argument I'm going to suggest is based on this book that Zach mentioned, that I published a few years ago. Fortuitously right before the 2020 election with my friend Suzanne Mettler, who teaches at Cornell, called 4 Threats. So if we begin by thinking about the contemporary moment in American democracy, the first among the things that our minds go to first, and this is the first set of pictures on the handout, is January 6, 2021, which was a violent insurrectionary attempts to overthrow an election. That's the only way I think that we can faithfully describe what happened on January 6th. Yeah, and I apologize for the people on Zoom. We'll have to figure out how to. Most of the pictures are just, for something for you to gaze at while I'm going on. Not essential for the argument. So January 6th was really the most singular, I would say, anti-democratic event any of us have witnessed in our lifetime. And in fact, people our age, I recognize there's a bit of an age range in the room, but people who came of age politically in the late 20th century, early 21st, really, I think, lived through a very unusual time in American history when there wasn't quite the same sense that democracy was vulnerable. So I think what happened on January 6th and the years leading up to it and the years following it have come as somewhat of a surprise to us. And it's tempting to dismiss what happened on January 6th as a singular, an unusual event in American history. And what I want to suggest is that it wasn't so unusual. This has happened before, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be scared. And the argument that now that I'm going to compress a complex, an elaborate argument that we make in this book, but this book came out of a set of conversations that my friend Suzanne is an old friend who also teaches American politics, This book had its origins in a set of conversations that we had after the election of 2016, when people who study American politics for a living were kind of caught off guard because something happened that we didn't really expect to happen, which is something somewhat of an embarrassing thing for social scientists to say. And we had conversations. We started having conversations among ourselves. Sorry, I'm wondering.
You're fine. You're fine. I can move.
We started having conversations among ourselves and with friends who also teach American politics, and we're all scratching our heads and trying to figure out how to confront this event. And then we talked to our friends who study comparative politics, who study politics in other parts of the world. And they would say the most terrifying things, like, oh yeah, democracies come and go. We had a pretty good run in the United States. Or, oh yes, they'd get very excited, their eyes would get big. Oh yeah, this is just like what happened in, and then they'd name some country where horrible things were happening. Turkey, Hungary, Brazil, Venezuela. And we'd think, oh great. But it turns out there was actually a lesson in thinking of, and this is not something people who study American politics do as often as they should, in thinking about the United States in relation to things that happen in other parts of the world. Right? We tend to think the United States is special, it's different, it's unique, it's unusual, it operates on its own logic and its own rhythm. But it turns out that in fact democracies do come and go, and we can identify by looking at other parts of the world a set of factors that are threatening to democracy. On the one hand, the United States seemed to have many of the features of countries that are stable democracies. It has a very old constitution that's been operating more or less successfully for over 200 years. It's been a democracy for a long time, and the longer a country stays a democracy, the more likely it is to continue to be a democracy. It's relatively wealthy, and wealthier countries are more likely to stay democratic than poorer countries. Democracy is a challenging thing for countries where average incomes and economic growth tend to be low. On the other hand, one of the things that we did as we were sort of doing the survey of what comparative specialists have learned about the rise and fall of democracies is that there are, aside from these things that are sort of supports for democracy, there are a number of factors that are threatening to democracies, and that when one or more of these factors exists in a country's politics, democracy can become shaky. And so the next chart, the sort of grid, is a little outline of these what we call the four threats. And I'll outline them very quickly, and I'm going to talk about each one of them a little bit historically. The four threats are polarization. That is the sort of division of the country, not just into political parties or opposing views about what the government should do or that sort of thing, but the division of the country into sort of us versus them, non-overlapping groups. And in the extreme case, the division of the country into groups where the one group sees the other group as an existential threat. So it was very hard for democracy to take root, say, in European countries that were deeply riven by class conflict or language or religious conflict or that sort of thing, right? So when polarization of that kind takes hold, democracy, it becomes harder and harder to sustain democracy. That's threat number one. Threat number two is what we call, in the book, conflict over membership, conflict over who belongs inside the political community. What are the boundaries of who has legitimate status as a member of the community? In the United States, that mostly finds expression around race, but also immigration, right? Who's in, who's out, who's part of the we and we the people, who has full status and full rights and who doesn't. That conflict runs through American history, but comes and goes in different configurations over time. That's threat number 2, conflict over who belongs or racial antagonism. Threat number 3 is economic inequality. Economic inequality, even in a wealthy country, can be a threat to democracy, although not always for the reasons you think. When economic inequality is high, and particularly when it's going up, the threat is not that, if you think of politics as, in some sense, a conflict between rich and poor, between the haves and the have-nots, the threat is not that the have-nots will rise up and have a revolution. The threat is that the haves, the people at the top, will go to great lengths to protect their status and their wealth and their incomes, leaving democracy, regardless of sort of democracy, right? We don't care about democracy, we just want our tax breaks. Is kind of the logic. And you see that in a lot of countries. The fourth, so that's threat number 3. The fourth threat is what political scientists have come to call executive aggrandizement, which is a lot of syllables to describe the concentration of power in a single hand. One of the things that we often marvel at about the American Constitution is that it's been generally very successful at keeping too much power from getting concentrated in a single person or a single group, right? Power, the US Constitution very successfully tends to disperse power, but when power is increasingly concentrated in one person, typically the chief executive, that can be a threat to democracy because that creates not the opportunity, if not the temptation, to reach for autocratic solutions to political problems. And what you see on this grid, if I were doing this on PowerPoint, so what we do in the book is we look at a series of previous episodes in American history when there was a similar sense that democracy was at risk, when people seemed to feel that, or when by the standards of the time, what democracy as it had evolved in the United States seemed to be at risk of moving backwards. And then the question was, in those episodes, and you can see what they are, they're listed in the left-hand column on the chart from the 1790s, and I can talk more about any of these episodes if you want. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of them in particular. What we discovered when we looked at these episodes was that they were all characterized by one or some combination of these threats. That when they went, when more than 1 or 2 of these threats was present, you got really quite cataclysmic threats, the Civil War in the 1890s, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But even when only one of them was present, you had moments where there was a challenge to democracy. Where we are today, and if I were doing this on PowerPoint, I would put up the chart without the bottom row, which shows the present, and show how in history there are these different combinations. And then the moment that would make you gasp would be I'd show the slide again with the bottom row that shows now for the first time in American history, and this, I think we could replace 2010s with 2020s. Now, for the first time in American history, we're living through a moment when all 4 of these things are happening at once. Yeah.
I'm noticing that conflict over who belongs has no X in the civil rights movement era.
Yeah, the way we're tracking that's a complicated one, it's some that the conflict itself is something that runs consistently through American history. When it becomes particularly acute, and the eras that have an X are when that becomes the main dividing line of politics. So in the 1790s, for example, the country was divided into these proto-political parties, the Federalists and the Republicans, and so on and so forth. There was really existential partisan conflict. No one disagreed over slavery. So it's not that was not an issue. It was not a dividing issue in politics at that moment. Similarly, in the 1930s, right? Roosevelt vastly expanded the powers of the presidency, so it gets a check mark for executive misconduct. But the parties and conflict was not divided deeply by racial inequality at that moment. So that's what we mean by that. So it's not that, you know, there were good times and bad times. It's when does it rise to the level of a sort of deep political conflict? That's the way we're tracking that, if that makes sense. So what I want to do is just, as quickly as I can, talk a little bit about each of these threats. Then I'm going to tell a little story about the 1890s, which I actually think is sort of a less well-known but disturbingly, eerily similar moment to our own. And then I'll stop. So let me just talk a little bit about polarization. So I am a political scientist, so I have graphs. So if you look at the set of graphs that's marked polarization Congress, these are just ways of showing that, I mean, we hardly need data to tell us this, but polarization has increased dramatically in the United States in the last couple of decades. Part of the polarization, first of all, is a challenge to democracy because it can soften or undermine the commitment to fundamental democratic procedures. The political scientist Adam Jaworski says, this is, I think, the most concise definition of what a democracy is. A democracy is a system in which parties lose elections, which is deceptively simple. But it means that a party has to be willing to lose an election. And, you know, we can all think back to a rosier era when, you know, you would be upset if your party lost the election. And you would think the Finks and the other party are going to do unfortunate things in their 4 years in office, but you know what, we'll get them next time. As opposed to the sense that, you know, if the other guy wins, the whole enterprise is over, right? That there's an existential threat if the other party wins. That's for most of us, I think, in our lifetimes, a relatively new phenomenon. So there are a couple of ways we think about polarization, or we can measure polarization. So these are pictures of, there's a lot of stuff behind these pictures. These are pictures of what I would call ideological distance in Congress. So there's a way of measuring the ideology of individual members of Congress on a liberal to Republican, conservative scale. Then you can measure the average Democrat and the average Republican, and you can see how far apart they are. Right. So in the middle of the 20th century, until about the late 70s, 1980s. Relatively speaking, the average Republican and the average Democrat were not that far apart in historical terms. But it's hard to read. But this graph runs from the late 60s, from the 60s to about 2018. You can see the average distance between Democrats and Republicans has grown a lot, right? So whereas in the middle of the 20th century, Republicans and Democrats were not that far apart, now they're very far apart. These are on the right-hand side, you have the same data, it's a different picture of the same data. This is in the House over the same period of time. The average Republican, that's the dotted line on top, and the average Democrat. So you can see the average Republican, the average Democrat in the House and the Senate looks the same, are getting farther apart. I will also point out that the Democratic line is relatively flat. That is, the average Democrat is about where the average Democrat was a couple of decades ago. It's the Republican Party that's moved considerably to the right. Yeah.
What's being measured?
These are scores based on an analysis of voting behavior, of voting in the House, of roll call votes in the House. It's really, if you want to get into the math, it's really a measure of how often members vote with other members. But it's used essentially as a proxy ideological score from higher, it's coded so that higher is conservative and lower is liberal, because the guy who did it was a Republican. Sorry?
The higher number is the more closely they voted.
No, that is the higher number, it's a sheer, you can read it as an ideology score. High is conservative, low is liberal. Yeah.
In the 60s, there were a lot of Dixiecrats that were very conservative, Democrats became Republicans. I'm surprised that didn't affect your curve. Right?
That's one of the reasons that the parties were closer together in the middle of the 20th century than before or after, is that there were the Southern Democrats. Although we're getting a little off topic too, Southern Democrats were a really interesting species in the middle of the 20th century because they were unified on racial issues, 98.3% roughly, with a few exceptions. On non-racial issues, on other issues, on sort of New Deal issues, on economic issues, on social welfare policy, on other kinds of things, they were pretty dispersed. There were some who were quite far on the left. There were some who were sort of conservative across the board. So they're much more heterogeneous than we sometimes remember, except on issues concerning race and civil rights and labor. But yeah, that's one of the reasons that that parties were compressed. I mean, some people think about the party system in the middle of the 20th century as essentially a three-party system. There were Democrats, there were some Northern Democrats, there were Southern Democrats, and there were Republicans, and they made coalitions. 2 out of 3 of them could make a coalition on anything. So most of the time it was Democrats against Republicans. Sometimes it was Southern Democrats and Republicans against Northern Democrats. That's why we don't have national health insurance in the United States. But sometimes you get Northern Democrats and Republicans against Southern Democrats. That's why we have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So, so that's one of the reasons that ideology was more compressed in the center, in the middle of the 20th century, as white voters in the South started voting Republican. Then you get more homogeneous, ideologically homogeneous and unified parties that start to diverge. That's not the only reason, but that's one of them. Yeah, that's definitely right. So that's polarization. Polarization has gone way up. Another way to think about polarization is that's about polarization among elites, among elected officials. Another way to think about polarization is polarization among the public. For a long time, and this was often a head scratcher, right? The public, if you measure the public's views about issues, it's mostly on the whole, on average, pretty moderate, and yet the parties seem to be divergent, right? That doesn't make any sense in a democratic system. The polarization public graph is based on data on something what's called a feeling thermometer. So in a survey you can ask, I'm going to give you a thermometer from 0 to 100, where 0 is cold and 100 is hot, and I'm going to ask you how you feel about something, person, group, issue, something on this thermometer. Where 100 is, passionate, and 0 is loathing, and and then you can spread yourself out in between. So the question here is, how do you feel about the two political parties? And the line on the top, the dotted line on the top, is the average feeling thermometer score for people. This is from the 70s to the 2010s, of how people feel about their own party. If you're a Democrat, how do you feel about the Democrats? If you're a Republican, how do you feel about the Republicans? You can see, first of all, people feel moderate, reasonably warm about their own party, and it's been pretty stable over time. The bottom line, the solid line on the bottom, is how you feel about the other party, right? And of course, people feel more warmly about their own party than the other party, but the bottom has dropped out of the feeling thermometer score about the other party. So people are increasingly motivated, and you can show that this has sort of behavioral, what the doctors in the room would call sequelae. I make fun of my wife for her jargon. She makes fun of me for my jargon, so we have a truce in the house. but increasingly people are motivated not just by liking their own party, but by disliking the other party, right? I want the Red Sox to win, but what I really, really want is the Yankees to lose. That's the best way I can explain it.
Robert, these
No, these are these feeling thermometer scores. These are average feeling thermometer scores. So I would ask you, how do you feel about the Democrats on a scale of 1 to 100? How do you feel about the Republicans? These are average scores on that scale. Got it? Is that clear? So again, even among the public, this kind of partisan polarization, this division of the country into two antagonistic parties, and sort of feelings of antagonism toward the other party have grown. So we're sort of sliding or have slid toward this situation in which the parties are not just sort of bundles of policy disagreements, but almost sort of social identities. Yeah.
Is there, does the data show like a reason why, like what people are thinking to make them go the other way? I mean,
Can you repeat the question?
I have some theories, but when you talk to people, does that data pull kind of the reason why?
Yeah, the question is why. The question is why. Why is this happening? What's the reason behind this sort of growing antagonism? That's a very there's a lot behind this. Some of it is some of it is related to the sort of ideological divergence, right? The parties are more ideologically far apart than they were. So there is an increasing sense that, if the other party were to win an election or take over, things would go bad for me and people like me. A lot of it has to do with, and this, I don't really have data on this, but a lot of it has to do with what political scientists call social sorting. We tend to now live our lives in sort of non-overlapping, reinforcing political communities. We used to think of parties as representing what we call cross-cutting cleavages. So society is divided up into a lot of groups, and they don't necessarily overlap. So so one issue might divide the room this way, with the people on the left on one side and the people on the right on the other side. Tomorrow, we're going to discuss an issue that's going to divide the room the other way. So the people on the front are on one side and the people on the back are on that side. So political identities and affiliations we used to think of in the United States as fairly fluid. And this is one of the things that often distinguished American parties and American political identities from, say, European parties that were much more sort of, this is the, I'm working class and this is the working class party. I'm a Catholic and this is the Catholic party, right? Were based on identities. Increasingly, partisanship overlaps with identity and in fact has become an identity. I'll give you, this is not what I was going to talk about, but I'll give you one anecdotal bit of evidence about this. There's a survey question that's been asked, not regularly enough to make that much out of it, but a couple of times over the last few decades. And the question is something like, would you be upset if your child brought home a partner of the opposite political party? Yeah, see? You can already tell where this is going, right? It's like the question, the question that would have given your grandmother fit, except replace party with another word. And when this question was asked in the 60s or 70s, most people didn't really care. People who identified as strong Republicans or Democrats cared a little more than other people, but for most people, that was not an issue. When that question was asked again, 10, 12 years ago, I don't know, it's not asked that often. The number of people who said, yes, I would be upset if my child brought home a partner of the opposite party went way up, right? So partisanship is replacing other kinds of identities in the American political mind. And that largely has to do with the way we've sort of sorted ourselves out geographically in terms of education, where we live, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
But that's an overlap with the polarization of the parties themselves, right? Because in 1970, when you said, would you care if your child brought home a Republican in a Democratic family? Well, you don't know if it's a Jacob Javits Republican or an Edward Brooke Republican or
Right.
I'm trying to think, Barry Goldwater, right? You don't know that. Now you know that, right? Going in, you know what it means to be a Republican,
Right.
and what it means to be a Democrat.
Yeah, no, these things are all related. So not only, so yeah, being a Republican now carries with it a much more well-defined, partly ideological, but also partly sort of social and identity set of indicators, right? Whereas the parties themselves used to be much more heterogeneous, and they were sort of less part of your everyday walking around identity. Yeah, so these things are all connected. Anyway, that's polarization. Yeah, David.
Does this apply, say, they're going to wait? I'm just wondering if young progressive Democrats are more firmly Democrats than they used to be, because I thought they seem to be rather wavering on party allegiance. They've got other views, but
Yeah, no, you're getting a little bit out of my depth here, but yeah, younger voters, my understanding is younger voters seem less attached to parties as parties than voters of earlier generations. I think that's true. Whether that, what I don't know is how that's going to carry over from today's young voters to older voters. I don't know how to sort of translate that into a prediction. Predictions are dangerous things. All right, let me rush through this. Okay, so that's polarization. The next graph, which is labeled racial resentment and polarization, relates really to the second threat, or to the sort of combination between the first and second threats. Right, who's entitled to full status and citizenship, particularly racial antagonism. So this is a picture of measures of something called racial resentment, which is the sort of modern way social psychologists and political scientists measure racial attitudes. You can't ask the old questions that you used to be able to ask about racial resentment, about racism, because people know enough mostly not to answer them. So this is a battery of questions and surveys about sort of stereotypical beliefs mostly about African Americans. Do you believe that, so what the graph shows is a growing divergence between, it used to be that the parties were not, people who identified as Republicans and Democrats were not that different in their racial resentment scores on average. Right? So that was not what divided the parties from each other. They were divided on a lot of things, right? But not on people who had not on racial beliefs among their voters, right? What this shows is that particularly since the 90s and particularly since the Obama election of 2008, the racial resentment scores have divided the parties much more than ever before, as far back as these data go. We don't have these racial resentment data much past this, because it wasn't a thing before before the 1980s. So that Democrats and Republicans now diverge a lot on this issue. This is one of the things that go back to the earlier question. Race is now an issue, or racial identity, racial beliefs is now an issue that divides the parties more than it has at most points in American history. And that, yeah.
Is there any way to know what's happened between 2016 and 2024?
Yeah, I could look at the National American, this is from a survey called the American National Elections Study that's done every 2 years, so I could update this, but I haven't. I would imagine that it's not that different from.
It was interesting to see white Republicans trending down toward 2016.
Yeah, I would be surprised if that has continued to go down, or yeah. What you don't know though is this is a big scientific national random study which has the virtue of sort of drowning out the loud voices. So I don't know, but my hunch is you're right that that's either stabilized or started to tick back up. But I don't know. We know from other data that the election of Obama as president caused a big rupture in sort of American political culture, political identity, and in partisanship. And I think that's one of the things that's being captured here. Yeah, Sharon.
2008 is also the crisis, the crash, and that, right? Isn't there an economic story here as well as a political one?
Yeah, no, yes,
Can
that's
you
right.
repeat that?
The question was the Obama election also coincided with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which yes, that has a lot to do with. But the counter. Imagine, if we had elected a white Democratic candidate in 2008, would we see the same kind of partisan and political identity rupture over the last 50 years?
But the polarization
that's
levels,
that's the question.
other numbers drop, but public polarization drops in 2008 too, diverges.
Yeah.
So there's.
Yeah. So it's hard to know how much of that is race and how much of that is other things, but.
Well, in addition to.
Yeah, I think that's right. But this is the world we're living in. The Human Subjects Committee would not let me rerun history.
But some people think that racial division is a symptom of displacement or economic.
Yeah, that's a bit of a morass. It's very hard to disentangle those things. But yeah, no, those things are definitely connected. Well, that brings us to the next chart. I'm going to try and, as I said, try to be quick. Rising economic inequality. You may have seen this chart before. This is a picture of one way of measuring economic inequality. It's data we have going back more than 100 years, which is nice. This is the share of income earned by the top 1% of income earners, right? So higher number means high inequality because the super wealthy are super wealthy. A lower number means relative compression of incomes, right? And what you can see was there was this long period in the middle of the 20th century, really starting around World War II and lasting until the 1970s or 1980s, when incomes were relatively compressed. And then since the 1980s, the level of inequality or the share of income earned by the super wealthy has shot up. This has definitely continued since this graph this has gotten worse. So we're now at levels of economic inequality that we haven't seen in this country by this measure since the late 19th, early 20th century, the last Gilded Age, really. I don't have a chart for it, so that's economic inequality. I don't have a chart for executive aggrandizement, but think about just the last few presidencies. And this is not a partisan issue. This is not something that just Republicans or just Democrats do. The chapter in the book about executive aggrandizement is mostly about Franklin Roosevelt, a little bit about Richard Nixon. But I became, as my family will tell you, in 2016, obsessed with Watergate. I mean, to an unhealthy degree. But anyway. But think about the way Washington has been working for the last decade or so, right? Congress can't get anything done. The president's come into office promising this, that, and the other, and now has all these tools in his toolbox to do things on his own. Student loans, immigration, we'll fix that. And it doesn't matter what Congress does. I have the power to do X, Y, Z, right? So the temptation in a partisan situation, when the other institutions seem to be kludgy and messy, the temptation for presidents to assume power on their own, usually through mostly legal means, the temptation is great, and that's a lot of that's what happened. All right, so let me just very, very quickly, I know I've talked more than I wanted to, but very quickly take you back to a historical story. So back to the 1890s. These are the next couple of pictures, which are just really just pictures. So after the Civil War, Black voting rights in the South were protected for several decades. There was a lot of success for Black candidates and Black office holders, at least as we know of at least 1,500 African Americans who held office in the South between the end of the Civil War and 1900, mostly in state and local offices, a handful in Congress, 2 in the Senate. Beginning in the 1870s and 1880s, you also had in the Midwest and the South a populist movement, and Republicans and populists in the South, in many Southern states, managed to join together and win elections against Democrats. Democrats were, of course, the party of the unrecalcitrant Old South. And in North Carolina, they succeeded in electing in the 1890s legislative majorities in the state legislature. They had several House seats. They had a U.S. senator and the governor at various times in the 1890s in North Carolina. So North Carolina was a sort of success story for the building of a new Southern politics. Well, in the 1890s, the Democratic Party, which was the party of white supremacy, was unhappy about this. And after losing a series of elections, Democrats decided that they'd had enough. And in order to reclaim power, they sort of gave up on electoral politics and began to adopt a strategy of intimidation and violence. This is not unique to North Carolina. Similar things had happened in other parts of the South, but this is a particularly focused version of the story. And they formed, there were sort of militia groups, these sort of white supremacist Democratic Party affiliated paramilitary groups, like the White Government Union. That's the little button on the right-hand side. The red shirts, the paramilitary group. That's the guys on the left of the slide with the button. And on November 10th, in 1898, there was another state election. There's probably fusion populist Republican ticket won again. And on November 10th, 1898, right after the election, a group of these militias gathered in Wilmington, North Carolina, which was at the time the largest city in the state of North Carolina, and a sort of epicenter of this sort of moderately progressive Republican populist fusion kind of success. So these militias gathered, they broke into the Wilmington militia armory, they gathered weapons, they burned to the ground the Daily Record, which was one of the first Black-owned daily newspapers in the United States. That's the picture of the burned out building. They rounded up local elected officials, drove them out of office. They marched a bunch of prominent citizens to the railroad station and put them on trains out of town. And they rampaged through Black neighborhoods in Wilmington. We don't know yet exactly still what the death toll was, but probably in the hundreds. This was the only way to describe this is as a coup d'etat. Right? This was a group of people who were out of office, taking arms and violently throwing out of office the people who had been elected to office. That was the beginning. That became the beginning of the process of disenfranchisement of African American voters in North Carolina, which is a story that repeated itself throughout the South through a bunch of constitutional and legal means. And it's the disenfranchisement and the consequences of disenfranchisement and the construction of the Jim Crow South lasted for at least 60 years. This is probably the most dramatic and concrete case of what we call democratic backsliding in the United States. The idea that the march toward democracy is not always a forward march, that sometimes it goes backwards. And what I started with January 6th, and I just want to come back to that for a minute and think about what I think are some unnerving parallels. They've gotten only more unnerving since I wrote this slide. Between the events of 1898 in Wilmington and the events of 2001 in Washington, right? The presence and 21. What did I say? Oh, one. Yeah. It's the past all kind of gets jumbled together. The presence and centrality of white supremacist paramilitary organizations, in 1898, we had the red shirts and the white government union. Now we've got the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. These were clearly directed at events, clearly directed at overturning the outcome of a legitimate election. Successful in one case, unsuccessful in the other case, but still they're after the same thing. One I just called a coup d'etat. The technical political science term for what happened on January 6th is an autogolpe, an auto coup. It's not someone who's out of office trying to get into office. It's someone who's in office trying to stay in office. This is a thing that happened repeatedly in Latin America in the 20th century. So the Latin Americanists in political science made up a Spanish-sounding word for it. And this is where I think we should be very concerned. In 1898, it was the coup in Wilmington was followed by mass disenfranchisement of Black voters in not just North Carolina, but throughout the South. There are, in fact, ongoing efforts in the United States, I think, to undermine voting rights, to disenfranchise people. I think the takeaway here is that you'll notice that there's a name that I have not mentioned in the entire hour. Yeah, there are many names. There are many names that I have not mentioned. There's one prominent name that you might have been expecting me to talk about that I have not mentioned. It's not just him. Right? He is the symptom or the consequence of a set of conditions that have been brewing in the United States for a long time, that have been around for a long time, that have combined before. And when we were working on this book, our publisher was determined that this come out before the 2020 election, which it did, unfortunately during the middle of the pandemic. So they did a very good job of concealing the fact that it had been published. But because they said, well, what if Trump loses in 2020? I said, we were insistent, it's not a Trump book. It's not a Trump book. It's not just about Trump. Trump is a consequence of a set of structural conditions that have, for a variety of reasons that we've gone into, converged in the United States to make this a very perilous moment. And I wish I had a more uplifting way to end, but I think I'll leave it there. Yeah, that's all I got. Sorry.
We have time for.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a possibility that because the Republicans are courting Latinos, that the racial attitudes might change within the party?
Yeah, no. In a word, I mean, I think the party alignments always are subject to change. They're always fuzzy at the margins. It's true that Republicans did a little bit better among Black and Latino voters in 2020 than they had in the previous few elections. Although Trump did, even though he did better among Latinos in 2020 than he had in 2016, in both of those elections, he did worse among Latinos than George W. Bush did in either of his elections. So I don't think I'm not seeing a rush of minority voters toward the Republican Party. The Republican Party has faced a number of choices over the last few decades about the Republican Party is now in a situation where it perpetually loses the popular vote in presidential elections. In the last, I think, 7 or 8 presidential elections, it's won the popular vote only once, 2004. And it's saved by the Electoral College. But so they perpetually, they lose an election, and this happened particularly after 2012, and they say, well, what do we need to do to get more votes? And the answer is always, we need, or has been for the last couple of decades, we need to soften our message, particularly as a way of recruiting minority voters. They kind of rejected that advice after the 2012 election. So I think the party has, for the time being, made its bed on the side of racial resentment. There are particularly Latino voters who are social conservatives. Latino voters who vote Republican are much more likely to be evangelical Christian than Catholic, which is a growing group among the Latino communities in the United States. So, I mean, maybe if that trend could, but I don't see this as a sort of opening wedge of a reformation of the Republican Party.
I'm going to take a question from
Oh,
here.
yes, sure.
What is your assessment, and I know you don't like predictions, what is your assessment of the potential for further damage to our democracy if that person you didn't want to mention is elected this year?
Oh, it's calamitous. I mean, I would say two things. One is he has been very explicit about his authoritarian intentions if he's reelected.
Only for a day.
Yeah, but he's talking about retribution, about getting even with people, about using the Justice Department as a spear against his enemies. I mean, this is how he conducted himself the first time around, almost by accident. I mean, but he's been much more explicit and intentional about it, number one. Number two, I think the effort among the people around him, you see this in the Heritage Foundation and other conservative organizations, to think about how to staff a second Trump administration.
They've had practice.
They've had practice, right? They screwed up the first time. He's not a competent man, right? And he was surrounded by incompetent people. And thank God now he has incompetent lawyers. But I think you'll see a much more streamlined and focused and effective administration that'll be less bumbling in sort of carrying out these kinds of efforts. So I'm very worried if he's reelected. But sorry.
One more question,
Yep.
and then we have to close.
Yeah.
In your matrix, your chart.
Yeah.
Is there perhaps a fifth threat that should be considered misinformation delivery? And, when you sort of compare to the 1890s, the proliferation of newspapers and just, there was a commonality in the kind of, people received their information by a similar vehicle. And now we're just so overwhelmed with alternate truths.
That's a tempting thing a tempting way to diagnose this situation. There is a long history of partisan and false information channels in the United States, going back to the 1790s, right? These groups that became the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were sort of forming inside the government, and they each started a newspaper that they would use the mail to deliver to people. Full of untruths about the other party. I mean, stuff that would make, today's cable news blush. They're just making stuff up about the other guys, right? And that's where people got their news. So the idea that there are separate partisan information channels that are rife with misinformation is not by itself new. Again, not my real area of expertise, but I would suspect that it's more the sort of speed with which news can be delivered now and social media algorithms, which feed you more of whatever you have consumed before, right? And what they want to do, what the aim of social media companies is to get you angry, because angry people act impulsively, right? Either to do whatever it is you're doing politically or to buy whatever it is they're advertising to you. That's what they care about, right? So I think what's different is the delivery mechanism, not the idea that there are separate news channels. Again, those of us who grew up in the mid to late 20th century lived in a very unusual time in the history of American journalism, when there was this sort of ideal of disinterested, nonpartisan, the newspaper of record, the way we were in my house revered the New York Times is an artifact of a sort of unusual middle of the 20th century period. One of the things we learned writing this book is that we're in a lot of ways sort of reverting to older, more deeper patterns of political conflict in the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.